So, um, I've been learning a bit about the Sea Peoples, right? And so we have the Bronze Age collapse with the, basically the Sea People come and destroy all of these Bronze Age civilizations, and we have what follows afterwards as the Dark Ages, where there's not a lot of we don't know exactly what goes on during that time because everything kind of gets destroyed and messed up. And so these Sea People come, right, and there's you know we don't know exactly who these people were, and we don't know exactly where they come from or why they came there, right? But I think, based off of descriptions that I've heard, right, there's some that came to basically live, like they came with their families to live in that area, right? So I think those are not necessarily Sea People, but they are refugees. Some of them may be desperate refugees, right? They initially were um, on some of these islands that got conquered by the Sea People, and they escaped, and they needed somewhere to live. And after being pushed to the brink, these people were desperate and willing to fight if required. But a lot of them, I think, probably were just trying to find refuge and a place to live with their families. So these are refugees more than anything, right? So there's those people. But then you have the actual Sea People soldiers and the ones that were coming to fight, right, and just kind of swept their way through Anatolia and down towards Egypt, right? And so, um, what I think is that, or what has been kind of in my mind, and I can't really let go of the thought, is the devastation of the Sea People, right? And if you think about this from a logistics perspective, like they're trying to think about why did the Sea People attack, and what was their motive, where did they come from, you know, and so there's theories that there was famine, right? There was a lack of resources, and so these civilizations decided to go get the resources from wherever they could find them, right? Or potentially they were on, you know, a uh, stretch of uh, conquering. They decided they were going to um, take over the whole Mediterranean region because they can, right? Um, and what I think is that um, when you look at this from a logical perspective, right? These Bronze Age civilizations don't really exist because they were razed to the ground, right? And if you're attacking these people, right, and you're out for conquest and for expansion, it's not really in your best interest to level every city that you come across, right? Raid it, right? Pillage it, take the resources, sure, but destroy the cities. Destroy their idols, right? Destroy their temples, fine, but destroy the cities. That's an incredible amount of energy and time that's invested into something that in theory they would want to keep and manage in order to help um, extend their expansion, right? Because if you're trying to expand your empire, basically, if you're trying to establish an empire and conquer the world, you don't want to destroy everything you come across because you need bases of operation, right? And it makes sense to use a well-defended city as your base of operation rather than building a whole new well-defended city, right? And so if it was an act of conquest and expansion, it doesn't really make much sense to destroy every city they came across, right? Take the resources, pillage the city. That makes sense. Yeah, that is a typical thing. Take the people. Yeah, that's also a typical thing. But destroy the city. I don't know. I'm not so certain that that is that aligns with that kind of mentality, right? So if it's not conquest, okay, well then they were desperate, right? They needed resources. They were hungry, right? They needed food. Um, okay, so they started raiding other cities, and in order to gain resources or gain access to resources in order to source more food. Okay, well, if that's the case, it also doesn't make sense to destroy the city because you need that city's resources and its means of producing more resources to continue so that you can get those resources, right? Because if you go to a city and you say, um, give me all your goods, and then you take those goods and then you destroy the whole city, you can no longer get any goods from that city, right? Whereas if you occupy the city and you say, make the goods or else, right, then you continue to get resources without having to go conquer more cities. And so it doesn't really make sense from that perspective, whether it was because were lacking food or um, they were lacking in resources, like they needed more tin or bronze or something along those lines. Like if they needed more resources, it doesn't really make sense to destroy those cities either, because those those cities would have been sources to provide the resources that they were lacking, right? And so it doesn't really make sense from that perspective either. And if you and so when you're thinking about this, it's okay, like, well, why did they do this then? Was it an act of desperation? An act of desperation doesn't require you to just plow your way through all of Anatolia and just continue conquering, right? There's no the only logical answer that I can come to, based off of the devastation and the vigor that and the consistency and the resilience that was used or carried through this whole operation of conquest, right? They were not out for resources; they were out for vengeance, right? These people, these sea people, were not attacking out of desperation, but it was an act of almost rebellion and resentment. That whatever, I guess, uh, influenced the the beginning of their quest to conquer the Mediterranean region. It seems to me that with them going into every city and razing them to the ground and continuing to do so with multiple rounds of campaigns over and over and over again, um, to me, it sounds a lot like, uh, this was more of a personal matter rather than a political one, more than anything, right? Like, how do you get soldiers to continue attacking and attacking and attacking and attacking different countries over and over and over again, especially if people are starving, right? Especially if, um, you know, the conditions are bad. You need a reason. You need a public enemy number one to be going after, right? Like, why were they so focused on destroying every city, right? Like, why would they do that? And I just went over why there's not a lot of logical reasons to do that. Um, the only one that really makes sense is that this was personal retribution, right? But then that leaves you with the question, okay, well, retribution against who? And that's what leads me to believe that there was some kind of collective civilization, or a um, a there was an empire that was established on some level that was unspoken because it was just how things were. It wasn't necessarily um, it was so self-evident, no one needed to talk about the fact that they were under the rule of this civilization. And when this civilization fractured, that's what sparked the rebellion, which led to the sea people, and everything kind of collapsed, and that's why after the Bronze Age collapsed, things didn't recover, and we have the Dark Ages, because the society that was propping up the world, or that region at the time, collapsed, right? It had too many fractures, and it just failed. And they capitalized on that weakness and made it fail soon. And then, because they either felt wronged by the system, or they um, felt that the only way to protect themselves from eventual um, destruction, right, retribution from this civilization they attacked, they felt that they needed to strike while the iron was hot and destroy every last remnant they could find of the civilization, so that there was no stronghold from which they could rebound. And so that's why I think the uh, sea people attacked with such abandon, right? And they just um, kind of rolled through every city and then slowly, like, faded out or disappeared, right? They went home or something along those lines, right? They didn't. I don't think that they really like, I don't know. I have to look more into the history, but I don't think that these sea people occupied and created an empire, right? Because if they did, we would know who they were, right? We would remember their names, as because they rolled through every city and destroyed them and conquered every city. It's not like they lost, right? So we would know who these people were if they created an empire, right? If they were for conquest, they would have formed an empire, people would have been under their rule, and we would know who they were, right? This would be in known history. But it's not in known history, because they did not establish an empire. They did not, destroy these civilizations and then bring them into their own fold, right? These sea people were only out for devastation, only out for retribution, only out to destroy. They were not interested in building. They had no interest in building. They probably thought whatever was built, right, to have structure in such a way was repulsive to them, because they had lived in a society with it, and it felt potentially, restrictive and crippling, and so they rebelled in a very explosive manner, um, and that led to the Dark Ages, because they did not want to keep the writing system of this civilization. They did not want anyone to continue the traditions of this civilization, and so there's no written history after the Dark Ages, because writing was probably made illegal and seen as a crime or something along those lines, potentially. Like, it was frowned upon to potentially pursue intellectual fields and interests, because that reminded them of the previous civilization that did have an interest in that, right? Because the Bronze Age was pretty advanced for its time. When you think about, the times to come afterwards, it was pretty advanced. And so what I just find interesting, right, is that um, I don't really see any explanation that makes sense, other than this was just an act of retribution, right? And these people went home um, to their own civilization. And the thing is the question is, okay, well, what was this civilization that they were, rebelling against? And that's probably a talk for another time. But um, I find it, uh, this mystery that has kind of been well known for some time now. Everyone's like, who are these people? Why were they doing this? And I feel like, um, not only do we not know who the sea people are, but who were they fighting, really, right? Because it sounds like these civilizations were teaming up together and working together in a way that they were all on the same side, right? They had already sent their troops as reinforcements to, um, other places, and so they got demolished, right? I think that they were all working together. They were all part of one society or one civilization, one empire. And there's like lore or something that like I don't know exactly where it's mentioned, but someone like an old there's like an old Egyptian thing that's had said that like one of the like ancient Egyptian scribes had said to I think like a Greek historian or something that they were once of the same people or something along those lines. They were once related, and that seems very cryptic to us. But I think the answer is that we were all part of one empire, one civilization that was a collective, peaceful place, which was the Bronze Age, right? And the collapse of this empire is the Bronze Age collapse, and the subsequent turmoil that falls after is the result of destroying all of your infrastructure and repressing uh, intellectual thought and communication and language and writing and things along these lines, right? And so that's what I think kind of is the reasoning of the Sea People at the very least. And so what they were fighting against, again, is for another talk. But that's that for now. Peace out. Yeah. So pretty much my thoughts are is that like granted people are not always logical, and that's something that I feel like I kind of struggle to grasp. It's like, why are we so illogical, so irrational, right? But so all things considered, the fact that it's not logical is not enough to be proper evidence, because we're dealing with people here, and people are just not logical at the end of the day. And so for this, I feel like it makes sense that when you look at how aggressive they were on their attacks and the results of what their attacks led to, and how we don't even know who these people really were. We have some ideas, we have some theories, we have, some information, but the fact that these people came, conquered all of these cities, but then just disappeared, pretty much, or assimilated in, and didn't really become an empire. To me, that's really weird. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And this is when we go into the Dark Ages, where there's not a lot of written records and stuff. And after coming out of a civilization that was civilizations, not even just one civilization, but civilizations that were constantly keeping records and had writing, to go into a state of none of that, to me, it just seems like, it just seems really abnormal. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense unless you look at it from the perspective that, oh, they were just out for revenge, for destruction, for retribution. They wanted to erase this civilization because they hated it, right? And so this was akin to the Crusades, but like for the Bronze Age collapse. This was like a divine crusade against the evil. I believe it's the Crete civilization that was kind of at least a big part of the center hub for trade and stuff. I want to say that the Crete civilization had a lot to do with this. I could be wrong, right? They may have just been another component of this, but their seeming religion and things tie back to everything else and make the most connections. So that's why I think that they're kind of the source for this. But the Crete people worshipped snakes and were very woman oriented, and to me, this makes a lot of sense when you look at where society went afterwards, right? Because we have records of women warriors and women queens and kings and like rulers and stuff, right? And then
that just goes away, right? And to me, for it to just go away, it kind of seems like, oh, that's because they made it go away, right? They were like, we can't have women leaders because if we let women lead, then they will take over again and they will oppress us. And, we can't have that. Women are evil, snakes are evil, bulls and horns are evil. As you look in, all of these things tie back to Crete civilization. And this Crete civilization, to me, seems like it was like a hub of trade and a very organized civilization that was probably kind of passing along, or like, in was in kind of like the organizational or managerial class of, these people, where they were assigning people to go rule different regions, right? And they're assigning regents to these areas. But something happened where these regents decided, you know what? I don't need you anymore. My people love me, and I'm going to do it myself, right? This is this act of hubris. This is this defiance of God that we see all over the Bible and stuff, right? And so they say, I'm going to do it by myself. And then pretty much God says, you naughty kids, I will destroy you. And so we get like the flood myth. We have also, what's that other one? We have, there's different purgings throughout the Bible, right? And I think it has to do with this kind of thing, right? And a part of me thinks that the flood myth may not be as literal as it was once thought, but I don't know. It could be kind of assimilated into the overall flood myth, but I think that there was some kind of purging that happened, but it wasn't a purge by flood of water. It was a purge by flood of blood, and that got cleaned up and made a little bit nicer to read, right? Because there is, in Egypt's mythology, there is this basically flood of blood where I don't know what goddess it is, but one of the goddesses goes out and just starts killing everything, right? And I don't think that that is myth. I think that that's based off of something real. And because of that, I feel like there's a lot of connections here that tie back and make a lot of sense. And, looking at this from the outside, I don't have all the information, but it seems like this fits together the best. This civilization was running everything. Something happened where they either decided to leave, or eventually they just became corrupt, and all of the good leaders, right? All of the wise and effective leaders eventually died, right? And so who was in charge of this great civilization was corrupt, and the sea people were justified in destroying them, and that very well could be the case. And I feel like it's the most probable, because while there was a lot of stuff going on at the time, I think the only way for a great civilization like that to fail is arrogance and folly. And so it does fit together well with the story. It fits together well with what was going on at that time. It was kind of like a Black Swan event where there was just so many things going wrong at the same time. And so they ended up in the collapse, right? And then because they destroyed this culture was built off of this legislation and writing and records keeping, and so that was seen as evil, right? And that was seen as wrong, and so it just didn't really happen for a while. And then they realized, you know what, this was actually useful. We'll just not use their language. We'll make our own, right? We'll use a different language. and then they went from there. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Peace out.